Hello, and welcome to Smiley's. Tonight we're joined by a very special guest. Last episode, Circa, was about an interview with Ian Esselmond. This time we're joined by Steven Erikson. Hello, sir.
Hello.
I'm joined also by Maura. Hello, Maura.
Hi. This is such a great pleasure because I don't know. It's always fun to have you back, Steve. How are you doing?
It was good fun last time. I do remember that.
Yeah, thanks. So I think the first thing we'll just ask you straight away is how is the writing going? Any updates for us?
I think I slowed down a bit over the holiday break. Life gets in the way, but I'm back on track, and I'm still planning on the second Witness novel being done probably end of April or maybe May. So
Very nice.
Yeah. And then I'll take a short break by writing a Bokaling Corporal Brooch novella. And then, because that will be the second to the last of those ones. And then I go into Walk in Shadow, the third Kharkanas novel.
Is it hard to do one series after the other rather than doing them continuously one after the other?
Yeah, and that's why I'm doing the novella, the Bokaling Corporal Brooch novella, because it's kind of a palate cleanser. You can just sort of have fun with that kind of stuff, and it just sort of creates a bit of a gap between the two major works, and so it gives me sort of breathing time and recovery time. And then Walk in Shadow is going to be well, it already is. It's a challenging work because the style is quite unique. Mm-hmm. The Kharkanas trilogy's writing style is a fairly peculiar one, and I have to sort of move back into that kind of track in my mind and get the cadence back up and get all that kind of stuff going. So it's definitely something that's going to take a bit of preparation. I mean, I've got maybe 300 pages of it written. I don't know how much of that I'm going to keep. I'll have to take a closer look when it's time. But if I can keep a lot of it, then I'll be happy because things will have proceeded. At the same time, I may start on page 1 and just go through it again. We'll see.
Yeah. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking over you. You please feel free to jump in whenever you want.
No worries.
Yeah. So I was just wondering about Kharkanas because you said that you read a lot of Shakespeare to prepare for that particular tone of writing. So, and the more we read, we keep thinking that it ties in a lot with the standard Greek tragedies, the type of stories we see there. So I was just wondering if did you ever consider making it into a play or something like that, something in a different form rather than a straightforward novel?
No. Basically, what I did was I think I had a Kobo, and I downloaded the collected works of Shakespeare, and I'm assuming it's complete, and so I just read it through. I read all of it. So there's more than just plays, obviously, and all I was looking for was to what extent I could capture that declamatory sort of methodology of his writing, and then to test to see whether it would work in fiction. Because I mean, a lot of that stuff is primarily meant to be orated. It's meant to be spoken out loud, and quite often on a stage. And so I still wanted to capture that, and it made me realize very quickly how our style of writing, narrative style in fiction, has evolved over time. But I really wanted to sort of, I guess, evoke a sense of the deep past. And so that seemed to be a fairly good approach to take. And it also allowed a lot more usage of poetic convention as well. So
the framing is actually like an epic poem. It's within the book, it's hardly considered like a straightforward, just a novel or something. It's basically a poem told by one poet to the other. And can I just say that Prelude of Forge of Darkness, I just randomly listen to it every now and then because it's so beautifully written, and the narration is extremely good on the audiobook too. So
yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah.
He was one of the few, for Forge of Darkness, he was one of the few, at least at the time, few instances where he was going to be reading the novel and he contacted me to get pronunciation down. Okay. And normally that just hasn't been happening. It's happened for The God Is Not Willing, and that was great.
That was really good.
And she was fantastic. So this is one instance where, and, at least the person doing the reading actually had took the effort to get the pronunciations right and all that kind of stuff, and that was good fun.
Yeah. No, I think Emma was extremely good. That was like one of the best narrations. I don't listen much to audiobooks, but God Is Not Willing, her performance was something else. We like in the fandom, we keep thinking that, is it possible to like ask her to do all the books and like have an entire set narrated by one person?
I know, and for the main series, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, I wasn't contacted at all, and of course they switched readers halfway through as well, which is unfortunate. But there's not much, as the writer, there's not much I can do if it's it's already happened. It's not like I'm in the studio there and participating in any sense.
So just one more publication doubt, because the Subterranean Press, those things are coming out, the pre-orders and all, and it's it's a specialty publishers, and it's not really something for the masses. So we were just wondering, like, who exactly do we need to contact? Like, if we wanted, like, I'm sure there are a lot of us who would like someone like me who is just an ebook reader. I hardly collect physical books. But with Malazan, because I just like it so much, and it's much nicer to flip through the physical books. So like I have like a couple of books collected already. So I was just wondering if there is a possibility to get like a matching set of books for maybe the entire series or something. Like, is it completely with the publisher's idea? Or?
Yeah, it's pretty much, I guess, petitioning the publishers. But I've asked for that a number of times. But what I do know is Subterranean Press, I think their intention with this new release is to go through all 10 books. So that will be a completed set for sure. And there may be a similar company in the UK that may be doing something very much like that. But as for the main publishers, I mean, my books are primarily the backlist books, and those tend not to be sort of returned to in any sense. Once everything's in place in terms of the books and the printing, it's a major undertaking to go back and reset all the manuscripts and all the rest, I guess. So unless something sort of happens whereby I don't know, television rights or something, or film rights, whatever, create some kind of public demand, then it's probably going to stay the way it is.
So we were all thinking like if we could get a Kickstarter started or something.
Yeah, we floated a lot of ideas about getting a reprint.
Yeah. Well, it's also down to how the publishers themselves are negotiating with specialty publishers. And those are always done as separate deals between the two publishing houses. So it would be Tor Books making a deal with Subterranean Press, or Random House Bantam in the UK making a deal with a specialty publisher in the UK. That's kind of how it's done. So it's not really something I can have much control over. So once these deals occur, then usually what happens is I get a box of signing sheets and arrive in the mail, and I have to spend a couple of evenings signing my name to sheets that will go into the book, and then courier comes and picks that up, and then that's kind of all I have to do until the next novel.
Right.
Lee, please go ahead.
Yeah. So for posterity's sake, since we're on this topic, recently you announced you were writing a book on writing. I think it was on Facebook. And friends and Redditors on the sub have often asked about this because most people don't use Facebook nowadays. And we figured this is a bit more accessible. what sort of details would you give, or rather, what sort of advice would you give to an aspiring writer who is looking to get into writing but hasn't necessarily the experience of a workshop or something like that?
I mean, workshops can be. It comes down to what the individual requires as a writer. One thing a writing program does is it conveys, even if it's an illusion, but a sense of officialness, a sense of legitimacy might be the better word for it. So in other words, if you enter a writing program, you're expected to write, and it's an academic endeavor, and so you become the student to the writing and in the program, and that can be really, like, psychologically really useful, because it puts the necessary sort of attention and mindfulness into the whole process of writing, and a structure is imposed on you, and you have to sort of adapt to that structure. So, the idea of say, writing a short story and then rewriting it for the next 5 years is not particularly useful. So, like, writing programs will have an expectation of, you have to produce 2-3 stories per term, and that's a great discipline in and of itself. And then there's revisions, are usually expected as well. So writing programs can be useful in that respect, and they do teach the craft of writing. At least they should. A good program should teach the craft of writing. So narrative structure and narrative structural terms and all that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, from what I understand, there are plenty of programs that don't teach that stuff. There's no lecture component, which is a bit unfortunate. But so you have to really sort of hunt and see what program is going to work best for you. But if you don't have the money for it, then you're kind of left floundering. So another way is to set up your own writing group and make sure that it operates under similar rules to your standard workshop format. But again, getting people to show up can be a challenge. So you got to definitely pick and choose and make sure that everybody's committed to the endeavor, because it can be pretty frustrating. And that's why I think programs at colleges and universities are good, because you are expected to show up and you're expected to contribute, not just providing stories, but providing feedback to the other students. And right. So there are different ways of, and I talk about that in the book. I talk about the various options that you can take. But I mean, the key to it all is to just keep writing and to finish what you start. Those are the two main elements. Having said that, this book on writing is a very strange book. It's the middle section will be all primarily the essays that I've been posting on Facebook over the last 10 years. So that stuff's very autobiographical, and the lessons on narrative that exist in them are implicit, and so you can sort of tease those things out if you need to. So it would be an unusual book. It's not your standard how to write a novel kind of book at all. So
you've been writing that in between, like even now?
Yep. And it's so much easier because it's just my natural voice, and so that could be sitting watching a hockey game or whatever on television and be writing this stuff. And I don't know. I mean, I've got I think I've got AP Canavan on board to be the editor. So I'm quite confident that he can sort of hammer this thing into some kind of reasonable shape. So that's sort of where we're sitting at right now. And I've gotten quite a ways. I assembled the essays, and that was like, I don't know what it was, over 300 pages. So we're going to have to sort of pick and choose. Can't use them all. And I repeat myself, obviously. So.
From what I've seen, AP doesn't, like, he has a confidentiality clause or something, because he never reveals who he's editing for unless the author comes forward.
Yeah, this is probably, in fact, I probably just spilled the beans on him here. So he'll probably be mad at me for that. But I mean, I want his name on the book too. So I want to give full credit for his efforts and have him participate in this thing. So.
And he'll be in the next novella too, right?
He might. Apto Cannibalian. Yeah, he might show up.
Okay. Yeah, Lee?
If you have any more questions on writing and the like before we get into the more pertinent Malazan stuff, Maura, because I'm gonna go off in a second.
Okay. Okay, just wait. Because there is, a couple of friends who wanted to know, like, because Malazan, you have built the world because of all the gaming, and it's taken like a number of years, and that's why it feels so rich. What about people who are just starting out? Like, do you give them, what kind of advice would you tell them specifically about world building? Like, how do they approach it?
Well, read. But also, there is nothing wrong with being inspired by a particular writer and to attempt to emulate that writer's style. I think in many ways, when I was first starting out, if I was reading something that I really liked, I would just completely match that style. But then I'd move on to the next one and match the style of that one. And I think what generally happens is when you finally sort of find your own style, it is a combination of all those things. It's a melding of them. So that makes it unique. It's not, you're no longer sort of mimicking anybody. You're pulling elements from all these writers whose work you admired and the styles they're using, and you're creating something new out of all of these things. So if I were to point at two particular styles and writers as influences on the Malazan Book of the Fallen, it would be Stephen Donaldson and Glenn Cook. And they are complete opposites in terms of their writing style. But I can see, if I look over, which I don't do very often, but if I look over some of the earlier scenes of the books and stuff, I can see both writers and their influences have somehow blended together to produce the style that I used for the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And it's not something you necessarily have to work at. It's something that happens naturally because each of us has our own set of experiences and they're unique. And we bring that to whatever story we're going to be writing. And so there really isn't an instance, unless you're plagiarizing. What you write is going to be yours, regardless of the influences. Now, if you lift complete plots, then that has worked for some people, but I wouldn't recommend it.
Okay. Just one thing, the more we get into Malazan, like apart from the first very few initial books, it gets deeper and deeper into philosophy and thematic explorations because that's one of the highlights in the back half of the series for me. So I was just one of my friends was asking, like, how exactly do you keep track? Because it doesn't feel like a repetition across all the characters. So how do you how exactly does it work? Like, there are so many hundreds of characters and each one has their unique take, and how does that come across in the writing and all?
It's about immersing yourself into that character, wearing not just wearing their clothes, but wearing their skin as well, and everything about them. So I think if you move into that, you kind of lose yourself, and you become, or rather, you see the world from that particular point of view of the character that you're inhabiting, and then it's just a case of how relentless is that character in their introspection. Some characters are not, don't introspect at all, and you have to sort of let them do that, and so those ones are conveyed to the reader in terms of what they do and occasionally what they say, but not what they think. But other characters, I give a lot of downtime for characters to be introspective and to pursue the bigger questions without answers. I certainly don't have the answers, so I'm happy for them to ask the questions and just leave it at that. And it's just, I knew I couldn't go super heavy into that thematic stuff and the philosophical stuff early on in the series, but I figured as I worked my way through the series, I could delve a little bit deeper, because I was assuming that if the reader has stayed with me this long, then they'll stay with me for this, and that's why I kind of expanded that kind of stuff, because all the groundwork had been laid by that point, for the reader, hopefully, certainly for me. So it gave me a bit more leisure time to explore that stuff, and then of course it's always a challenge of, well, how do you wrap that into your story? How do you tie it all back up? And I like challenges when I'm writing. If I'm not feeling challenged, I basically stop writing. So I need to challenge myself. And that was one of the things that was driving a lot of the writing in the later part of the series.
Maybe I think we can just go on to spoiler section. I think Lee is just waiting.
I think so.
Please go on.
I don't have very much on the Book of the Fallen, actually. On the topic of, I think we have more questions from friends than our questions. So.
No, I was just because we are reading Reaper's Scale. We are all rereading Reaper's Scale on the subreddit right now. So we have a very few questions there. We were just wondering about Errant, because universally he's hated, and for some reason I don't hate him as much. So I was just, because even the first time when I read Midnight Tides and then Reaper's Gale and all, I was just, he's fine. He's just doing what he's supposed to do. Like, that's his nature. And I don't know why people just revile him. Like, the things he does in Kharkanas is completely different. Like, I'm not even considering that. But at least here, does he warrant that much universal hatred? Like, what are we...
I don't know. Yes and no. He embodies random chance, and all of us who live in our world, we rail against random chance all the time. Various events happen in our lives that are inexplicable. They have no sort of recognizable cause, but we experience the effect, and that can be something that one naturally rails against. But it was interesting writing Erastus, at least at that point, the errant, recognizing or having the character recognize the almost the helplessness of his function and his purpose, and trying to reconcile himself with that notion that, in as much as he's wanting to be in control of his life, the aspect of his powers are actually rejecting that at every turn, and so he's a very conflicted character, and that kind of made sense to me for a character that is bound to random chance.
Yeah, because that's how I feel. Like, it's beyond him, and I don't know how we can hold him responsible. It's only to some extent I can hold him responsible, because that's his whole nature. We can't consider him in terms of how much agency does he have. I think again and again it boils down to questions like that, like how much can we hold him responsible for his actions. But he gets worse as it goes on, but at least till this point I've read.
It's one of the questions that it's the kind of question I like to have the reader or the audience ask, but I don't have any answers for it. It's simply one of those things to ponder, and then for however long you want to. But I wouldn't advise anybody to obsess over it. It's just a role he plays.
Yeah, but it's it's fun for us to discuss, because each of us have a different take on the same things, we read. And just one thing from House of Chains, when Cutter washes up there and Underist saves him, there's a single line mentioning something about let's not awaken him. He might get awakened by the presence of life here or something. So we were wondering, is there something sleeping at Rift Valley, or because I don't think it comes up anywhere again. I was not sure.
It's too far back. I cannot remember.
Okay. Anything else, Lee?
From the Book of the Fallen, not that I can think of. Well, actually, there's a few things, but that do tie into Kharkanas. But one of the main things I've been obsessing over, which I probably shouldn't be, as you just said, but I am obsessing over it, is mythopoeia and in general just myths and legends in the Book of the Fallen and especially Kharkanas, because, well, the Book of the Fallen is essentially a collection of accounts from Kaminsod, right? He collected everything. He wrote his own book, his own account, his own take on how things went. And obviously that forces a narrow scope on the story. It forces his own agenda. Corrupt, for example, embraces it completely. He says, I'm going to just tell a tale because you guys look sad, and here's how to deal with that. Kaminsod feels a bit more reserved in that regard of and Gallant takes that to a whole new level of I am going to straight up invent things to prove a point, but we're going to get to that as well. Kaminsod feels more reserved in this regard, though a lot of his character sort of permeates through in the glorification perhaps of characters like Tavor, Fiddler, or even Shadowthrone, whom reads very different in Kam's books than the Book of the Fallen.
Yep.
But one of the things I want to know about is the legends that Kaminsod has access to, and other characters view them differently. For instance, especially the Theist myths that we see in Kharkanas, and stuff like the Rage of Kalor, which I've been obsessing over a lot lately. The origin myths of different cultures, like the Nerek or the Aimas or whatever. Because we're viewing this through like a lot of different accounts, from myths to Kaminsod to you. How would you approach writing something like this in different contexts, through different agencies of Kaminsod's agenda, or Krupp's agenda, or Gallant's agenda, or Fisher's agenda, or whatever? How do you differentiate between the lot? And is there any merit in searching for the truth, quote unquote? Because I don't think there's a truth to be found here.
I think if you read histories, and if you read histories from two distinct but conflicting sides of a particular thing, so two nations, two languages, whatever, two cultures, and if you are actually, I don't know why you bother, but if you are looking for some kind of truth that sits in the center of all of this thing, some completely objective position that is fully balanced and all the rest, generally you will find it by taking the two opposing sides and arriving somewhere in the middle. That's probably where the truth is. It's somewhere in the middle there. And to me, that just sort of, it emphasizes just how malleable and how amorphous this whole notion of truth actually is. And the fact that almost anything you recount from your own personal experience is through that lens. And that lens may have a conscious agenda, driving it, or it may be an unconscious one, or it may be a product of the worldview that you've absorbed from the culture and the family, where you grew up and all the rest. And so by trying to show as many sides to particular events as possible, I think I've described it before as it's a big invisible boulder that's sitting on the plain, and each of these approaches, each of these interpretations, is like slapping clay on that invisible boulder. And so that's what kind of gives it the shape. But you can't really, there's almost nothing at that core. So all you're doing is observing the shapes. So that's kind of how I sort of view the function of story and mythology that's underpinning, the Malazan world, or in a more general sense, the fictional world that you've created, whether it's set on a secondary world like Malaz, or here on Earth. It's all down to point of view, and point of view. When you start thinking in terms of character and creating character, it's probably a good idea to begin with at least some notion of their worldview, and then to use that as the lens and the filter by which you then have that character observe and experience things and believe things and recall things, and all these things. So there is no sort of objective truth going on here. It's all about perspective, and that's kind of that's why Toll the Hounds is so much a cipher, because it's the smaller version of what is the main series in terms of that kind of that meta element to the narrative, which is implicit in all narratives. So that's kind of what I was wanting to play with. And I don't know if I just jumbled the whole issue and turned it into a completely confused mess, but that's certainly possible.
I mean, I got nothing pretty much. I think you covered all my bases. Yeah.
When we were talking to Cam, we just asked him who exactly is Edgewalker, and my biggest surprise was that apparently an answer exists, because I was just thinking that it is just some random mystery and we're never ever going to find out about that. But he just told us that he doesn't want to reveal it because it's
there's a definite answer to that.
Okay.
And it's, I mean, fingers crossed I live long enough, but it will be in Walk in Shadow.
Okay.
Right.
That is the biggest surprise for me, because
I think you just made
an answer.
I think you just made half the fan base want Walk in Shadow all the more. So
it's a pretty cool story.
I think you have. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say it's a cool story that Cam created in Edgewalker, and so I remember contacting him and asking. I said, will you give me permission to reveal this stuff in Walk in Shadow? And he said, yes, of course. So that's what I'll be doing.
Okay, right. We were all just convinced that it's just some random mystery and there's no explanation or anything.
Oh no, it makes perfect sense. Edgewalker makes perfect sense.
Okay.
Yeah. Cam definitely has that talent for creating things that will just surprise the hell out of you. Yeah. But then once it happens, you think back and you think, oh yeah, of course, that makes perfect sense. It's inevitable that that's how it was. So yeah.
Okay, we'll look forward to that. Now, one more thing to look forward. Go on, Lee. I think you have a whole bunch of questions.
Shall we dive into Kharkanas now then?
Oh yeah, I think we are already there.
Well, where to start? I guess from the prelude would be the best place since more brought up. I actually wrote a couple pieces on both preludes, both Forge of Darkness and Fall of Light recently, because I took an interest in things like the poetics of Aristotle, Ars Poetica, Seneca's stuff, Shakespeare, as you mentioned. And I wanted to see, through the lens of such works, how can I interpret Kharkanas? And one of the things that stood out to me most is how Galen basically hits every base that Aristotle points out for a tragedy, how to play out, from the emotional gratification, from the catharsis, to how everything is set up, which is fascinating because the way Aristotle writes these things, it's for plays, it's for stage plays on theaters, not for, which we brought up earlier. And I found it very interesting because, well, obviously, Aristotle borrows from Homer, and then future poets and playwrights build on that to culminate eventually to Shakespeare, which is the most refined of all these arts. But I just really found it interesting because I saw Galen and essentially going with a checklist, tick this, tick that, of every chapter of the Poetics I'd read that far. And for everywhere from the Galen bringing up Anomandaris as a brave title, how it's not just Anomander's tale, and how Aristotle brings up at some point that a lot of authors, a lot of poets make the mistake of thinking because one person's life is a unity, that means their work must be a unity. That doesn't work. You can't write an Anomandaris and expect it to be a good thing on its own. You need to incorporate other people.
Yeah.
And so the other thing is how a poet differs from a historian, which Galen also brings up, and is a common theme throughout Kharkanas. Generally, I was just very, very surprised to see how well I could map these things. It's not perfect, because there is a bit of a 2,000-year difference there. But I was wondering, to what extent did you look into, we brought up Shakespeare, but did you look actively into literary theory of such works with the intent of writing a tragedy, for instance, or a play, or you said you weren't intending to be a play?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it was really early on, I guess, when I mapped out the ending to Deadhouse Gates, that it suddenly struck me that, I looked around at a lot of the literature and even stuff we were watching, in film and television that was going on at the time and to this day, I think, and noticed that tragedy seems to have dropped away. It is the one form that has become increasingly rare in our entertainment discourse, regardless of the media. And that kind of made me interested because, early on, I mean, reading Aristotle and sort of intuitively understanding that idea of catharsis, I kind of looked around and wasn't seeing enough catharsis in our world, and certainly not being represented in fiction. And you get these sort of apocryphal tales of a film being made with a really tragic ending, and they test it on an audience, and all the audience hates it. They hate the ending, so they go and change it into a happy ending, and then the film comes out. And so there's a kind of a resistance to the idea of tragedy. And so with Dead House Gates, I thought, okay, I'm going to set this up to make it look like you're going for your happy ending, and then I'm just going to do the opposite, and then see what the response would be. And then I followed on, of course, with Memories of Ice, really pushing that tragic element. And I think the Malazan Book of the Fallen sort of follows that particular. I've described it as is tragedies with fantastic elements rather than fantasies with tragic elements. So, but then, of course, this is spoilers, but you get towards the end, and I'm going to flip it, and that's what I did. So then I moved to Kharkanas, and sort of understanding that we were heading for basically a civil war, and that's what this was going to be about. That I needed a point of view that was not going to pick sides as such, but was going to explore those elements of tragedy, whereby history seems to create an inevitability of these things occurring. But then there's a whole other side to this, and that is something that is implicit in Aristotle and a lot of approaches, but is not specifically highlighted, and that is the anthropological approach to storytelling. And you talk about the early plays that were performed in ancient Greece, and they were clearly participatory in a sense that we don't necessarily automatically understand. And you could see where the lines blur between audience and performer when you move into Dionysian rituals, or sort of the wild nights of madness that would be actually part of a ritual activity, where your audience has become profoundly dangerous at the same time. So there's an anthropological side to the function of storytelling, and that idea of it blurring the divide between the audience and the performers. And so I really wanted to keep smudging that divide increasingly throughout. And that's kind of why I chose a poet telling the story to another poet, because that way there's a level of self-awareness to the story that they create that is shared between the audience and the creator, and that allows a kind of deliberation that sort of underpins the story being told. That there's almost a meta awareness of the themes, and like you say, checking all the boxes. So they all have particular functions. They all have particular purpose and intention that goes beyond just the story itself, and that's kind of what both Galland and Fisher are aware of, and so that's kind of what I was exploring. It's kind of what I was interested in looking at. I don't know if that made any sense at all. Sorry about that.
More, do you have anything to add in particular?
Just about the prelude, because as you say, it smudges so many boundaries, and at so many points it's you talking to us before we begin this series, and you telling us straight up that discard this entire if you want peace of mind and all that. So at some point, I keep thinking that when because it's two poets talking to each other and they have this mutual respect. So at some point, I keep thinking that it's you addressing Cam at some level. Is there some element there? Because it's I don't know.
Probably, but not consciously so. It's more me addressing an audience that has consumed the Malazan Book of the Fallen and Cam's books. So in other words, they've absorbed as much of the cultural ethos of the Malazan world as possible. So they, in that sense, they are a knowing audience. They are an educated audience, educated in the Malazan world. So I think that there's a large role of that, because by the time I got to writing Kharkanas, people were starting to do rereads of the earlier books. And generally, when one of the Malazan books came out, it didn't sort of gain traction, and people would be on the Malazan Empire's site or something and not liking that book, and then 6 months later they loved the book, and it took time to sort of sink in, I guess. But by the point of Kharkanas, I was comfortable enough to at least fool myself into thinking that, okay, I can push it to this one higher level, because the readers have already been with me and Cam for like 16 books or whatever it was by that point. And in many respects, that kind of failed. I think what happened was I didn't leave enough time in between. I probably took all of 2 weeks off after finishing The Crippled God before I started Kharkanas, or Forge of Darkness. And if I had taken a year and 2 weeks off, that may have worked out a lot better. So.
Yeah, like it must be exhausting, isn't it? It must have been really exhausting. I'm just thinking.
Well, no.
I mean, we are just consuming it.
Yeah. No. I thoroughly enjoyed writing Forge of Darkness because the style was different and the voice was different. And that kind of, when I was thinking in terms of breath length and oratory, that kind of liberated a lot of the language, and it gave me permission to go more poetic, in the same fashion that Shakespeare would go extremely poetic in his declamation for within the especially the poem, or not the poems, the plays. So yeah, it was a really interesting experience, and once you fall into that cadence, the writing style, it's very seductive. So I certainly enjoyed writing it, but I did hope for a lot better response than I got. That's for sure.
I mean, there are people, because it's still not completed. Mm-hmm. So there are people waiting for it to at least have a publication date and all that.
Yeah, and that's fair enough. Absolutely. Yeah. Too many readers have been burned by that. So.
Yeah. Lee, go ahead. I think.
Yeah. So I have a lot of questions, but one, let's start from the beginning again. What prompted the framing of Kharkanas? Because we pretty much know from the get-go, unlike the Book of the Fallen or Toll the Hounds even, which is sort of cryptic and somewhat vague in the prologue of is Krupp telling this or not, Forge of Darkness starts off, so you have met me and you would hear the tale. Mm-hmm. He tells you from straight out of the gate, I'm not there. You walk into these halls, you walk into my memory, my creation, you won't find me there. He brings up Fisher. It's you and I, we know of these things. We understand these things. We know this language. This is for the audience. Mm-hmm. So what prompted this sort of framing, if it's not... You mentioned earlier you wanted to choose someone who doesn't pick sides to narrate this, but I'm hesitant to ask why, because I fear what I'll hear.
Well, no, I mean, he may pronounce that he doesn't pick sides, but he's definitely got a side going here. And the narration he creates is a self-conscious narration, because he's looking across, the table at Fisher, and he knows he can't bullshit Fisher. All right. So there's a self-consciousness that both of them are aware of. And to me, this struck me as, bearing in mind the meta storytelling aspect that the Malazan Book of the Fallen is framed within. This seemed to be a logical next step, that, if I can indicate through the events and the conclusion of the crippled god that everything you've seen before is not just a linear narrative telling of a history, but it's a very, very self-consciously shaped telling of elements of history. So once that precedent has sort of been set, then it struck me as very logical that I would take it to the next step and say, okay, in this time you're going to see almost a conversation that could have occurred between Cam and Sod and whomever, that preceded the writing of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. But in this case, you're actually seeing it on the page. And it's almost an elaboration on the two poems that frame the Malazan Book of the Fallen, because there it's implicit. There's definitely a voice speaking to you, and there's definitely an audience. But for that series, that audience becomes the reader. In this case, I'm pushing you one step back from that the audience is not the reader. In this case, the audience is Fisher. But you know Fisher now because you've read his poems. He's played a role in things. And so you have to sort of acknowledge that he's going to be listening to this with a level of awareness that Galan has to be aware of and has to acknowledge and play games with, because he's definitely playing games in this narrative, and he's aware that Fisher is aware he's playing games, and so it sort of becomes a bit more complicated that way. And Galan is immediately going to point out that he's not going to meet Fisher's expectations, because Fisher, he wrote Anamandaris, and so he's got his version of these events, and Galan's not going to play those games. He's not going to appease Fisher's own curiosity about what really happened. He's got his own purpose at stake here.
Yeah, he does state that why I'm not impressed with the Son of Darkness. I have my reasons and stuff.
Sorry?
Galan straight up says that he has his reasons for not liking Anamandaris as much as the others.
Yep. But if you think as a reader who reads that, do you think you're going to ever find out his reasons?
I don't expect that.
No, it's going to be built into the story. It's going to be built into the role that Anamander plays in that story.
By the end of, I think, Fall of Light, it's a little iffy. He's not the nice person we have seen in the Book of the Fallen. So he's pretty rude and rash and not very likable here.
Well, I don't know. He certainly, Galan is even forced to acknowledge some of the gestures he makes, particularly regarding Hishtula and what's his manservant? Can't remember his name now. Anyways, who ends up with Hishtula? The one with Hishtula, yeah. Yeah, when he sends them both away to ensure that they survive. So every now and then, he makes the right gesture, and it's almost grudgingly conveyed by Galan.
Yeah.
So bear that in mind, right? That there will be some element of history that Galan is going to be and has been exploring, and he will be grudging. He will begrudge some of those truths that he sees. And, so you'll sense that resistance from him, but he's going to do it anyways. So
you're just aware that he's going to be biased, and there's nothing really we can do about it.
No.
One of our mutual friends started reading recently, and he keeps texting us like what exactly is going on and how his reactions basically, which is a lot of fun for us. So he knows, like when he started Forge of Darkness, he was well aware that this is not about Anamander, and he's not going to show up on page and all. I think by 6 chapters in or something, like he was getting frustrated. Like, come on, this is Kharkanas. Where where is Rake? I'm not going to even a single POV on Rake, and even with all the warnings and stuff, it's hard to. I mean, I'm sure I would have been impatient when I read it for the first time. I don't remember now, but it has to be right, no matter how many warnings you give and how blatantly you say that this is what is going to happen. Expectations are one thing, isn't it?
They are, and I'm certainly experiencing that with the Karsa, the Witness trilogy, because he's not going to show up until the third book. That's just how it plays out. But I have warned people, and it may frustrate them, but I think even when he shows up, he's going to frustrate his fans for sure.
So he's like, I am a huge Karsa fan, and Lee can't stand him. Like he would be happy.
Put it that way. But yeah.
Okay, yeah. Please put it the way you want to. Like, what do you think about Karsa?
I don't know. This is not about Karsa, but I was rather unimpressed at first. Rather, at first I was impressed. Then on hindsight, I was like, do I really like this guy? Do I care about this guy? I landed on yes, kind of, but and I didn't really see a way out for The Gods Unwilling, and then I read it, and he didn't show up, and then book 2, he didn't show up. I'm like, hang on, this might actually work out. So the lesson, as always, is trust the author, but Mora is a massive Karsa fan. I'm not a massive Karsa fan. So we have this kind of dichotomy about the character, and I think, especially given the other implications in No Life Forsaken, it's also one of our most look forward to books.
With the adjunct, and we're really looking forward to having those new characters with the small excerpt we got. Yeah.
Oh yeah, which may not actually appear in the book. I don't know if I'm going to stay with that storyline or not. I don't know.
We did a whole episode on that.
Yeah. But, it's a complicated storyline, and then can I weave that into what I'm presently writing? I'm not sure yet. So it doesn't mean I'll dump it. It means it may show up as a novella. It may show up as a short novel. The stuff that you read in the excerpt, because it runs parallel with other events that I'm exploring right now. So
I think the last time we spoke, you were writing Marines and you were having a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah, that's been the problem. It's too much fun. Yeah.
No, I think all this, because we are reading Reaper's Gale now, that's one of the peak Marine fun starts, where once they start invading and Hellion comes up and, and the rest of it. Yeah,
and it's just, again, very, very seductive to fall into that lifestyle that you're then sort of exploring through the writing, and how the characters sort of shove their way onto the page and basically don't want to leave. And as the writer, you don't want to leave either, because it's just so much fun to write them. So yeah, they've been demanding a lot of space and a lot of time in the story. So that's why I'm sort of, I wrote that excerpt and popped it out there, but I haven't gone back to it in the sense of the chapters that I've written since. So if you think about that, it's been quite a while, and I have not returned to those players at all, because the Marines are taking center stage, and they're very reluctant to leave. So
yeah.
While we're somewhat on the topic, one of the characters that stands out in said excerpt is Fish Jalan, who Mora also likes a lot, by the way. And throughout the novels, from the Book of the Fallen to Kharkanas to here, No Life Forsaken, we see a very peculiar relationship with poetry, right? Galen is very, how do I put this? How does he say it, actually? No one lets them die in peace. No one, they are picked over. They're like list makers that are like carrying on your work and stuff. Jalan calls, because he's named by a lot of things, Fist, Rebel, Son, Godless, Musician. And right before he stabs Ingar's, the Blinker moniker, he mentions that the only curse among those titles is poet.
Mm.
And then there's also Fisher, who acts as a mouthpiece to Duiker in All the Hounds, right? Because he needs to get the story somehow out, and the best way is poetry. So what would you say is your relationship with poetry, and how much of this is self-referential or autobiographical, or because it's a motif I've noticed?
I don't know. It's an ongoing, fraught relationship internally for me. Just as sort of tragedy seems to have fallen out of favor as a particular form of storytelling, poetry has I think without question fallen to one side, and I think part of that is a kind of inevitable result to almost a collapse of nuance in discourse. So language ceases to have a sense of precision. And so, as a writer, that's something I end up having, I mourn that loss, because precision for me is everything in communication. And as a writer, you have to be mindful of that precision. But modern discourse, maybe all discourse, but certainly I'm seeing it now. Precision is definitely diminishing. And so terminology, phrases, things on that fans of books who are on BookTube dropping various phrases like world building or whatever. You hear that there's no precision left in what that actually means. And I mean, AP Kahneman's fighting the lone rear guard action on this one, because this is where his PhD came from. He's all about narrative, and there is a precision of terminology, which he's fighting for, and it's a noble fight. So yeah, and the relationship of art with culture, and then the relationship of art with history, and how these things are evolving, and quite often falling to the wayside. And those are things that as a storyteller, those are things I'm going to be inevitably obsessed about, and so they will seep into the narratives when there's opportunity to do so. I mean, the only time I really let loose on that stuff was Crackpot Trail. So.
Yeah, I have to reread that, because that was a different type of experience, After all the
yeah, it's a strange one. But so normally I'm more constrained, and so if the circumstance allows, that stuff will slip into the story, into the novel. And of course, with Kharkanas, it is front and foremost. It's right there, and so that gives me a lot more freedom to really sort of dig into the meat of that. But for these witness novels, they're a bit more straightforward in many respects. So there are fewer opportunities to kind of sort of do that. But then stumbling onto Jelena as a musician, that gave me the opportunity there. So.
I don't know if you did not confirm this, but does the Witness trilogy have a narrator or something? Like, is it possible we are seeing it through Rand?
Yeah, no, I'm really messing around with that. Sorry. It's no, it's an invisible narrator.
Oh.
That's all I can say.
Okay.
They're present, but they're invisible. Yeah.
Yeah. Lee?
All right, so to circle back to Kharkanas, because this is partly what it's about. How do I phrase this? Okay. I brought up mythology and mythopoeia earlier, and one of the main instances in which we see Galan before Kharkanas is the Sheikh mythology. Right? He's a Taist poet. He's a seneschal of the court mages of Kharkanas. He led the Sheikh out, I suppose, by convincing, I think, Selkas, whatever it was. I don't quite remember the details. And in essence, Galan, beyond the Sheikh myths and a few flashbacks from, I think, Sandalath it was, doesn't really appear within the Book of the Fallen whatsoever, which, tracks in Kharkanas because he's not there either. And one of the things I couldn't help but notice, since I brought up Aristotle earlier, is Galan feels a lot like a nod to Homer. Right? He's blind, he's a poet, he has a nigh mythological past. Homer, I think, in tradition, is born of a nymph and a river god. Galan could be, who knows? I don't know, actually. And one of the main scholarly debates about Homer is his historicity, right? The Homeric question. So I discussed this with Niflrog, actually, whose theory goes that Galan does not exist. He is a construct of chiefly Fisher within the Kharkanas trilogy and a myth or a legend of the Sheikh and whatnot in proper quote-unquote mythology. My take on it is that is not the case, but I believe Galan does not exist within the Kharkanas trilogy events described because he wasn't there at all, because he was born before, right? Because the Taist in Kharkanas, in the events described in Kharkanas, still have a relatively small time. What is it? What's the word? They don't live long anyway. They're far from 300,000 years that Rake lives or whatever. And there is mention by Kroll in Fall of Light, I think, of the first Taist, right? That their soul taken because they mix with dragons. And all of this has happened before. There is a cyclical element to it. Like the wars of light and dark, there have been before. Curdle and Teleras are looking for the Shadow Throne because it's happened before. And so my understanding, or rather my theory, not my understanding, because I would be lying if I said I understood this. But the theory I've been toying with the past few, I don't know, a week maybe, is essentially the historicity of Galan as a whole and characters within the trilogy itself, mostly like Renar or Renek or things like that. And to what extent did a narrator like Fisher create Galan in the Kharkanas trilogy as a framing, because Galan himself is, again, this is a theory, in my view, an amalgamation of old Taist artists, poets, mages, what have you, in mythology. And so Fisher essentially borrowed that figure of Galan, propped him up before him on a metaphorical table, inserted him to speak on his behalf, because if anyone would know more than average about Taist mythology, it would be Fisher, because he's logged into lays, he's talked with people, he is friends with Anandi. He would know more than the average person about, if not the histories, at least the myths which he would be exploring. And I've gone on record before in saying that I think Kharkanas is a cautionary tale of Galan, and clearly it's not meant for him because these events have transpired before. And in Fisher's case, maybe, though from a meta perspective, I think it's a cautionary tale for the readers, not for someone in the world. Like, this is how these people went to shit. Don't do it. But I've been talking with this idea, and I figured I'd ask, because what better to ask?
Well, yeah, I mean, every novel is, even a fantasy novel, is still in dialogue with the world around us. So at least I certainly approach it that way. So it's a once removed observations about our world, but placed into this fictional invented context. So now think back on one of the methods of discourse that was very prevalent in classical Greece, which of course was the dialogue, where Socratic method as well, but a fictional or potentially fictional questioner or interviewer or whatever, who then makes statements basically reflecting average sensibilities of those people who are going to be reading or listening to this. And then they philosopher responds and gives answer and creates challenges to confound that basic general audience. So that stuff is there's already precedent for that. Now, in terms of Homer, first of all, I'd say straight off the bat that the Iliad and the Odyssey are not written by the same person, but also that we are looking at one surviving record of a long-standing collective oral tradition. So there would have been many storytellers, and there are particular conventions to mnemonic devices on terms of remembering those stories. So all of those are in play, and those things are evolving over time as well. So the Iliad especially is a Bronze Age pseudo history, but it's fraught with Iron Age references running all the way through it. But it's not just the technology that is modernized, if you will. I'm sure there's elements of the storytelling itself has been modernized to suit that audience. So the notion of the role that and the personage of Homer, I think, as you say, it's an open question. I don't think it's particularly relevant. That's the thing. I think what we're looking at is a survivor in terms of storytelling from our previous age. That age being the Bronze Age rather than the Iron Age, but it's a survivor into the Iron Age, and then from the Iron Age into all the way up to the present, which makes it really quite fascinating in many respects. So what does all that got to do with Galan and Fisher and all the rest? Well, you could argue that Fisher creates Galan in the same fashion of the discourse of the dialogue that is required. But then Fisher does what all artists do, which is step outside himself and fictionalize a narrator, which is what storytellers all do. So sure, you can certainly interpret it that way. I'm not going to give you a direct answer one way or the other.
Of course not.
Niflrog's right or you are. But those elements are certainly all in play when it comes to Galan, Blind Galan. And, the callback to Homer in terms of blindness, sure. But like I say, it's complicated stuff in terms of the influences and things I'm thinking about. And I don't necessarily, iron them all out and flatten them onto the page at all. I don't mind the wrinkles and the questions and the uncertainties. And I think that's more the anthropology background rather than background in reading histories or the classics and all the rest. It's the anthropological stuff that interests me, and that means the function of art, the function of discourse, the function of communication within a culture, within a society, which is constantly evolving and changing. And so when we reach back to the past, we're just sort of getting this frozen moment. But we have a hard time contextualizing it because, we're not in that culture. We're not in that civilization. We don't necessarily recognize the fact that so much of these stories have a metaphorical function rather than a literal function. In many respects, we kind of lost that culturally. There seems to be a culture of literalists these days. But I think a lot of what was existing in the mythologies and legends within those ancient cultures was metaphorical, not literal. I know that opens a whole different can of worms. I talked about it a bit in the book on writing, so maybe I'll save it till then.
Interesting. Yeah.
No, you're completely confused, aren't you?
I mean, I was expecting a more or less non-answer of, sure, you can use it that way, but I'm not going to tell you. And that's what I got, so excellent. I believe more I wanted to ask something regarding the acknowledgments of Kharkanas and its framing as a love story, I think it was.
Yeah. Because, the timing, because we're talking like so close to Valentine's Day, and it just stood out to me that Force of Darkness is the one which is dedicated to your wife. Mm-hmm. So do you consider like Kharkanas like a love story or all? Because at the core of it, no matter all these other things which is going on, it's the core of it is Draconis and Mother Dark. So that's the way I'm going to see it.
Oh, interesting. I don't know. Generally, when I do a dedication, it's also taking into account the, have I dedicated a work to a particular person close to me? And my very first book, which you can't even find, called The Ruin of Feathers, was dedicated to my wife. And so it was kind of a full circle thing. She was still my wife by the time I got to Forge of Darkness, and is still my wife now. So that was an acknowledgement of just the struggles that we had gone through all that time for me to finally reach the point where I was able to be a full-time writer and all that kind of stuff. Are there love stories built into this trilogy? Oh, absolutely. I remember reading somewhere where somebody pointing out that Erikson doesn't do romance. I didn't quite agree with that. I think I tend to be more understated in these areas unless I'm completely going overboard, which, say, Crackpot Trail does.
No.
Or various other, I did a hockey novel that's completely overboard in the amorous elements of fiction. But I thought this one I wanted to sort of actually go further into. To me, there's some very strong sort of romantic elements in Forge of Darkness and Fall of Light. And a lot of it is related to either two characters falling in love, or in the case of the Tartheno, is it Tartheno? Toblikai, whatever, with three husbands. Yeah.
Lazarus.
All that stuff, yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of that stuff going on, and I think of the when you get to the end of Fall of Light, and you find that Lana Rook ends up having to accompany her husbands and her lover and all the rest into this journey to war against death. That's love taken pretty far, isn't it? And so that's kind of where I was pushing for that these deep bindings between people can have an inertial force and can pull people in places they don't expect to be, and maybe not even want to be. So that is one of the themes that I'm running through with this trilogy.
No, when people say that the Book of the Fallen doesn't do romance well, and that's so blatantly wrong, because Toll the Hounds has, like, I don't know, a dozen amazing stories going on. Like, what I feel is people mean that it's the rom-com part of a relationship. That is what you don't focus on, because it's a relationship when people have already met and people have already started working on being together. Like Kalam and Minala, they have a level of understanding. We just see the effect of it. We don't really see them going through. That just becomes a done to death thing to how do people meet and what they do and how they overcome things and stuff. We just go straight up to the relationship part of it. So
yeah, and at the same time, you could arguably point to Hellion and Herb as a rom-com.
Yeah. I mean, I'm noticing it only now because she's in love with Herb even from the beginning, and I did not pick up that at all the first time. Like, yeah. I mean, Hellion is, she's someone who deserves her own trilogy.
She was fun. She was a lot of fun.
Lee, I think you have something about Fall of Light.
I'm sure I have wanted something to ask. Okay. Yeah. What I wanted to ask is, I remember in an old interview about Fall of Light, you mentioned that you did not want to, I quote, write another fucking battle.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, because in a sense, Fall of Light deals a lot, among other things, with justice and preemptive action and love and the war and death and whatnot. And I was wondering, do you believe, I realize this is a bit, I don't know, lacking in taste to ask, but do you believe that if you could go back, would you change it? Do you believe, or more accurately, what I want to ask is, do you believe that not actually including a battle is more pertinent and better at getting the themes across over just another pointless slaughter of Leosin versus Andy, which has permeated a lot of the myths that we see in the Book of the Fallen?
No, there's no way I'd go back and change that. I'm on a personal level, I'm absolutely satisfied with deliberately deconstructing and dismantling and rejecting that final battle. And I mean, it was an honest statement on my part that I was tired of writing battles, tired of writing them. And in many respects, I maybe still am. I think even in The God Is Not Willing, we had engagements, but we didn't have sort of the full-blown, half a novel long and kind of campaign thing going on. It feels like I've been there, I've done that, and there are other aspects to conflict that are more intriguing for me right now. No, I have certainly no regrets on just breaking apart that part of the narrative. The whole climax being quite sort of clearly indicated as nothing but pieces moving on a board, as it were, guided, on the one hand by an innocent, and on the other hand by a madman. That seemed quite appropriate.
Like, you were aware of that before you started writing, because the prelude, I think, quite explicitly says that, I'm going to reject all this, and we're not going to glory in bloodshed and stuff.
Yeah.
So, like, it was all mapped out even before you started. You started writing Fall of Light.
Yeah.
On the topic, one thing I do particularly like looking, because I unfortunately,
I just want to quickly interrupt. That sequence at the end of Fall of Light it took longer and was harder to write than any battle sequence I've ever done.
Okay.
So, anyways, go
on. What I was going to mention is I had the, misfortune, I suppose, to listen to Fall of Light as an audiobook. It was my first and only audiobook. It was fine, but as my first foray in audiobook, it was not the best choice. What I do recall, and fondly looking back, is the way the battle is framed. First through Rise Harat, just narrating the how everyone is setting up, and then essentially Hennerald and Rennek dismantling the whole thing, circling back to the prelude of Galen talking about necessity. At the end, you have two parties who have been focusing so hard on what they must do, what they need to do, because it's one hand, it's survival, it's justice, it's recompense for the soldiers, it's power, whatever you want, for Rake, for Caladan, for Honral, for Santara, whomever. And then you have these two, a literal child who has been through hell, and someone who is regarded as a child. And the audiobook voice is very good for this.
Oh, good.
Because Hennerald has a very sort of fatherly, gravelly voice, and the excitement is portrayed very well. And Rennek is just lost in a very peculiar way. And as the scene progresses and Hennerald gets more and more excited about, look at these idiots, look at what they're about to do, contrasted with Rake and Caladan having a very serious conversation of I could annihilate these people now, but doing so would be really stupid, and it's just going to plunge the whole thing into more pointless civil war. It was fascinating. And then I very vividly remember that I was getting off the train or so when the ending of the marriage happens, and I was dumbstruck. Holy shit, what? You can't just end it like this. So I had to go back. Months went by, and I bought Fall of Light finally because I couldn't find it first. And the first thing I did was circle back to the very ending scene to reread that part. And what I want to talk about before, I think, because it's about time we should probably close up, is Urisander is a very divisive character among the fandom. And I couldn't help but notice Renar's disposition towards him. Because, again, to me, I don't know if this has come across yet, I have a very narrow field of vision for Greek myths because I am Greek. And a lot of characters in Kharkanas have used them for that. And Renar feels, to me, like a sort of fury character that punishes oathbreakers. And so her final scene with Urisander, looking past everything, the pomp of the whole thing, Sindara and Emerald, the significance, the weight behind the whole what it meant for everyone. To be able to coldly look at Urisander and be able to say, the best course of action for everyone is to end this here. That would be justice.
I don't know if that's what she's saying. I don't know if that's what she's saying.
Not necessarily. What I mean is, it's, in a sense, it's very cold, right? Because Urisander has been led, because, let's be fair, he doesn't have the most agency in the world.
No.
But Renar can sort of, very interestingly, keep in the framing of, Galan says in the Prelude of Forge of Darkness that Rake is being pushed, Urisander is being pushed, a lot of characters are being pushed from behind. Renar can step outside of this and critically judge everything. She forgives Osirk. She ends Urisander's life. She can judge the situation for what it is from a clear point of view. And I wanted to know, how did you approach this? Because this is a hell of a way to end a novel.
Well, you have to go back to the opening of Fall of Light. It's all there with Renar observing the battle. It's all there. Everything about what she is going to do is right there in Renar's first scenes. And so, you say you bought the book and you went and reread the ending. I'd recommend you go back and reread the opening, and that will answer most of your questions.
I have read a few scenes with Renar because one of the scenes being when she takes a soldier aside in a tent to have a sort of confession. One of our common friends, a mod on the subreddit, adores Renar, and I will admit freely, she flew over my head completely. So on the reread, I want to go back and look at her more than anyone else, probably, which is why I'm asking this specifically. How would you approach Renar?
Yeah, she's a very complicated character, very conflicted. And I think her witnessing the soldier's sacrifice in the tent, self-sacrifice, if you will, certainly, in a sense, forces her into a corner, at least in her own mind. And so everything that sort of follows is her preparation to something that she feels is inevitable. And if you go to the scene with Urisander, the question, I think, is left open to the extent to which Urisander recognizes what this moment entails, and the extent to which Urisander agrees with it, because he does turn and face the window, I seem to recall. And that's not entirely ignorant of the fact that he is in the presence of a young woman he does not understand, but a woman who might well have very, very good reasons for doing what she does. So that kind of ambivalence is supposed to be there. And so there aren't any direct answers on this stuff. You're left to wonder whether Urisander actually has orchestrated this as his way out.
Right.
In which case she's playing a role. And the question is, to what extent does she accept that role? And to what extent has the novel been, with respect to her, been her struggling against the role that she's been offered? So
I did not view it like that at all.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just looking up the last line. It just says that, like, she looks down and she sees a smile on his face. He's peaceful, content, and lifeless. So that's that's an interpretation which I don't think I've had before. I mean, it calls back to the whole Thai-Steeder betrayal between Silkus and Scavendary. Like, who betrayed whom there, and who was the ultimate, who manipulated whom exactly.
Yeah.
And because they think in terms of ages and millennia, not about, it's this year and what happens in the next year. It's their thinking is much more broader and much more immortal than that. So
yeah,
I think we have.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I started, there's a whole series of sections that I wrote for Walk in Shadow. And in all of them, I was avoiding returning to Kharkanas, or Kurot Galain, rather. I was avoiding it. And I that may still be the case, but eventually I returned to Renar. And at that point, in my mind, in any case, everything coalesced, and the story took off. And so once I knew that, okay, I'm at a point where when I get to this point, this story is just going to take off on me. Then I can relax. I can sit down and write No Life Forsaken and get the novella done after that. And then when I get to it and come back to Renard, I will be very comfortable in the place that I'm in. And it's curious because Renard is kind of the warped mirror reflection of Tavor. And
I did think of that, yeah.
That kind of role that she's going to play. She's unreadable in the same fashion that Tavor was. And I really like that. So I'm very happy to have found her locked in a cell in Kharkanas with Kataspala in the cell beside her. Yeah.
Like, is this okay, Steve? Because we've been talking for quite some time. Lee?
Unless you have anything else to go by, I think I'm pretty much done.
No, I just want to ask because we're going to start Forge of Darkness soonish, like in the next few weeks. Mm-hmm. So, any advice for us? Because we're both rereading and stuff like this.
It's Forge of Darkness always struck me as the most traditional fantasy novel I've ever written. I mean, your initial point of view, disregarding the frame, is a young boy. Well, not that young, but young in terms of maturity. A boy in terms of maturity, and it's partly, a story of his rite of passage into adulthood. I mean, how more traditional can you get for a fantasy novel? So yeah, if you read it that way, and you should be comfortable enough.
Yeah.
I think I've just been left with a lot to think about. So yeah, things to look forward to, I suppose.
I think having reading and discussing like a chapter or two at a time is probably going to do us full justice, because I don't know, Lee at least would have read that ending scene in Fall of Light, I don't know, a dozen times at least, and
easily
if he didn't pick it up. So yeah, we really need to have
it's meant to be obscure in terms of motivations. It's meant to be you're not sure about Erisander and you're not sure about Renard, and that's intentional.
Yeah. So, do you want to wind up? Steve, do you have any questions for us? Because
no, I'm fine. No, this was fun.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry we had to start in a hurry.
That's okay.
Lee, do you want to have an outro or something?
Sure. I guess we can. So thank you very much. It has been a blast. I believe both me and Maura have a lot to think about going forward. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, it's been fun. Yeah, I haven't thought or even talked about the Kharkanas stuff basically to anybody. So that's been fun.
Okay, so we have, I think by the end of Forge of Darkness reading, we'll probably have a bunch of more questions like this. And hopefully we can have a chat again.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Steve. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and good night.